Oh, howdy all, grab yourself a drink. It is time for some Path of Exile 1 discussion. There is a spectrum of power in Path of Exile 1 where you can have meme builds at one end, all the way through to powerhouse builds at the other. This is an attempt to go somewhere on that spectrum that makes something that's a bit of a meme build, but it's a meme build with some teeth. This is a Surfcaster I'm intending to play in the upcoming Legacy of Phrecia event. Why are we playing a Surfcaster? Because there's a lot of raw power in this Ascendancy. Now, because of the way that Path of Building is set up, all of the stats of the Surfcaster Ascendancy are actually baked into this jewel here that you see. So this jewel contains the entire Ascendancy. Stormy Seas, 100% of lightning damage converted to cold, your cold damage can shock. Ghost of the Deep, 20% increased damage, 30% attack and cast speed, 30% movement speed. Bated Breath, all hits are crits while holding a fishing rod. This is just ridiculously good, we'll get to why in a sec. Screaming Reels, 50% more cast speed while holding a fishing rod. Now, you'll notice a lot of discussion of fishing rods. How do you get a fishing rod, you might be asking? They're an uncommon but not staggeringly rare drop, but they're only available when you are wearing the unique helmet Fairgraves' Tricorn. Fairgraves' Tricorn has a hidden mod on it that allows fishing rods to drop. Generally speaking, you'll need to kill a couple hundred unique monsters on average to get a fishing rod when you've got a Fairgraves' Tricorn sitting on your head. Fairgraves' Tricorn is in the third most common category of unique items. So it's the same as Heat Shiver, it's the same as Calm's Spirit, same as a couple of other things that have been semi-meta in the past, like Cold Iron Point or Tremor Rod. These items can be 50 chaos on day one. They tend to fall down pretty quickly after that. I'm expecting Fairgraves' Tricorn to be in that range early on, and then to fall off to be easily available for 5C if you get to maps on day 3 or 4. Whatever the case, Fairgraves' Tricorn is your first big investment because it will allow you to get the fishing rods that are needed there. Now, you won't have a fishing rod to start with. While you're leveling the character, I would be inclined to take the retaliatory freeze node that's available in the Ascendancy, and also the one that provides additional benefits for inflicting chill on enemies. This is my initial thought, but that's something I'm quite willing to experiment with. It may end up being that my build needs sea legs, especially with the gear that I happen to have at the time, so I'm quite open to experimenting with that as well. But why is it that we're using a fishing rod? Well, firstly, because they're fun. Like, who hasn't ever wanted to equip one of the most ridiculous meme items in Path of Exile? But secondly, because actually there's quite a lot of power in that line, all hits are critical strikes while holding a fishing rod. There is an item that is used a fair amount on critical strike builds called Marylene's Fallacy. This item provides up to 288% global critical strike multiplier, but it does so at a very serious drawback. 40 to 48%, depending on the quality on it, less critical strike chance. There's a lot of other good stats on this. Marylene's Fallacy is a really good item, but it's a quite difficult one to use because you don't need to just get 100% chance to crit. You kind of start wanting to get closer to 190% chance to crit, and that's getting to the level of being ridiculous. However, all you need to do with the Surfcaster Ascendancy is just pull out the fishing rod, and you always crit. So that's the first reason. The second reason though, and the more important one, is there are a number of skill gems in Path of Exile that have a lot of trouble scaling any critical strike on them at all. Enter Herald of Ice and Herald of Thunder. Herald of Ice's base critical strike chance is 0. Herald of Thunder's base critical strike chance is 0. Both of these gems have a very hard time inflicting critical strikes. It's not that you can't increase their critical strikes. You can link them to things like increased critical strike chance support, and then if you do that, you get a base critical strike chance of around 2%. Then you can get a whole bunch of percentage increases on your character, and you can possibly get their critical strike chance up to 10 or 12 or 15%. In conjunction with the Assassin Ascendancy, some of the tools that are available there, and some true endgame gear, you can definitely get these into the 30, 40, 50% range. But getting them to 100% even without Marylene's Fallacy is really difficult, and getting them to 100% with Marylene's Fallacy starts to get into the range of completely and utterly ridiculous. Remember, critical strikes add a lot of damage. In Path of Exile 1, my critical strike multiplier is 489%, the way that we're set up here, and you could definitely do better than that. We want to be critting with Herald of Ice and Herald of Thunder. We also want to do a bunch of other things to make them do more damage, things that might otherwise seem a little bit silly. So where are we socketing Herald of Ice and Herald of Thunder? Well, they scale quite well with gem level, so we're going to be trying testing them out inside Pragmatism. This is a unique item that doesn't see all that much use, and it drops from the King in the Miss. The King in the Miss is the boss of the ritual content, and this is the most common item that drops from him. It has plus 12 to the level of all socketed skill gems, but then it has minus 2 to the level of socketed skill gems per socketed gem. So what this means is that if you socket 2 different heralds in here and nothing else, then they both get plus 8 to the level of socketed gems. Now you could also link them to Empower if you wanted to. If it was Empower gem level 4, that would increase the reservation of those heralds, but it would also increase their level by 3 from the Empower, then minus 2 from Pragmatism's effect, and they would end up plus 1 higher. I've elected not to do that, but it is something you could consider. That would require more gear on the character overall because you would need to have more reservation efficiency. That's Pragmatism. What we're getting here is level 29 heralds that always critically strike. This is really useful because Herald of Ice has text that allows it to self-propagate. Herald of Ice, when you shatter an enemy, which means when you kill a frozen enemy, that monster explodes, dealing more cold damage. But that cold damage is capable of shattering enemies as well, or freezing them so that they can then be shattered. What this means is that Herald of Ice can self-propagate, but on top of that, you also have Herald of Thunder. Herald of Thunder deals lightning damage, the Surfcaster Ascendancy is converting that into cold, and so this is capable of chilling and freezing. But also because of the Surfcaster Ascendancy, it has a text that your cold damage can shock. Unfortunately, this doesn't work though because Herald of Thunder has explicit text saying that it can't shock, and in Path of Exile 1, can't trumps can. So it's not able to shock, it's not able to propagate itself. But every time your Herald of Ice kills an enemy, that is capable of shocking, and as a result, you end up with this self-perpetuating loop of sorts, where killing one enemy with one of these heralds can end up setting off a whole bunch of other ones. Right, so this is Editing Gog here, just wanting to point out that Pragmatism is simply a plan, but it's not necessarily the plan we'll stick with forever. There are definitely some other chess pieces that are on my mind. The first of them is Inpulsa's Broken Heart. Now, this does not provide any amping up of the damage to the heralds that we're using, but it does provide us a little bit of life. It provides us some increased percentage damage if you've shocked an enemy recently, and we're going to have that pretty much all the time. Increased effective shock is really good, but mostly it's that unique ability, shocked enemies you kill explode, dealing 5% of their life as lightning damage, which cannot shock. On top of this, it also grants you unaffected by shock, although currently we're solving that through an aura instead. Now, shocked enemies you kill explode, dealing 5% of their life as lightning damage, which cannot shock. This is capable of critically striking, and in fact it's always going to critically strike because of the way we've set the character up. This is incredibly strong, and it may end up being the way that we go. Using Impulsa's Broken Heart will significantly nerf the amount of damage that we're doing with our heralds, but it might end up that it's a better package overall. Additionally, another option we need to consider is Skin of the Lords. Skin of the Lords and also Skin of the Loyal, which is a very similar item, these are always 6 linked, and they come with +2 or +1, depending which version you've got, to the level of socketed gems. They have a +100% global defenses, which is really nice. That's going to be a boost to evasion rating and also energy shield across the entire character. In that way, this ends up being slightly more defensively minded. Additionally, we can also socket into our Skin of the Lords and Enlighten support. And even if that Enlighten support is only gem level 3, it's going to function like a gem level 5 Enlighten, and that's going to address some of the mana reservation issues we've got. The final option that we've got for a chess piece is just using a stock standard defensive setup that is something very similar to what all the tricksters in Path of Exile 1's 3.25 League are using. That will provide a whole bunch of general good stuff. It'll provide some elemental resistances which we need, and it's another very real option. Or we could even go for something crazier. We could corruption hunt on various influenced chess pieces that happen to have a few good stats on them for us, but potentially +1 to the level of socketed gems, which is then something that we can corruption hunt with. We don't need very many socketed gems in here, so we don't need to invest in chroming and 6-linking and all of that sort of stuff before we corruption hunt. We can then just go ahead and make something that's just got 3 or 4 links on it, apply a Varlob to it, and if it works, it works. If it doesn't, it doesn't. The sorts of mods you'd want if you were doing this, you would want to have one of the +2 corruptions that applies to Herald gems. So there's a couple of those from memory. And you'd also want to have +1 to the level of socketed active gems as an explicit modifier. That's available in Shaper Influence, and I think it's Warlord Influence, but I'd have to research that. It might be Redeemer Influence. And then on top of that, you would also want to have some life and some sort of resistances. This would be another package that you could get. So there's a lot of different things that we could use. Ultimately, Pragmatism isn't necessarily the best choice, But the pragmatist in me points out that it is a reasonable starting point that we might end up finding something better for later. Now, on top of that, we also have to do something to get the loop started and also to deal damage to tougher single targets. For that purpose, introduce Crest of Desire. Crest of Desire is a little used helmet that allows your helmet slot to sort of be a 6-link with a difference. Now the key difference here, Crest of Desire has only one socket in it, rather than the 4 you would normally be able to have in a helmet, but it has a bunch of text that gigabuffs that particular socket. The intention here is that that sort of gets it up to the point where it's about as good as a normal 6-link, but not as good as the best possible 6 links. The exact text, +5 to 8 to the level of socketed gems. Now this item is rare enough, it only comes from Heist. It seems to be among the very rarest things you can get out of Heist, so it's rare enough that it's worth divining to 8. The second line, 30 to 50% increase to the quality of socketed gems. My plan here is I want to divine it until it's got 8 as the first mod, and the second mod is at least 40. I've run the numbers on this so you don't have to. It's about 13% to hit these two simultaneously. So you're looking at 7.5 to 8 divines on average that you would need to apply to your Crest of Desire. Fair warning, this is the average. Some people are going to get unlucky and not going to hit this combination in 21. If that happens to you, well, that's RNG. Sometimes it's going to happen. If you don't want to take that risk yourself, you can always just look to trade for one that already has good rolls on it, and of course pay the appropriate premium there. Now, socketed skills deal double damage. Note that this doesn't stack with other sources of double or triple damage, but that's fine, we don't have any more of those on the character. And then 125% increased armor and evasion. Just forget about that, it's there, it's not hurting your character in any way, but it's not the reason you're wearing it. We're wearing this because of one key thing. That is, whatever spell that we use is going to be affected by Screaming Reels. It's going to have 50% more cast speed. Crest of Desire is going to keep the amount of mana that this spell drains under control, because it is going to be out of control if you try and use a 6-link skill and you're doing it with 50% more cast speed. You'll then need to invest in mana recovery, and that's going to end up making the character as a whole less able to focus on other things. So, Crest of Desire, we definitely want to use this, and we want to put something spammable in it. That's the purpose of Crackling Lance. That is the reason that we're using that as our helmet slot. After that, the rest of the gear is basically, well, Marylene's Fallacy, pretty stock standard stuff. We're using a Ventors Gamble here because we need a little bit of mana reservation efficiency. I don't think this one is a sublime one, but it is a genuinely good Ventors Gamble. We have Storm Secret, which is something that is really strong in conjunction with Herald of Thunder. We have Storms hit enemies with 50% increased frequency. This is a perfect roll, but it is a reasonable perfect roll to get because this item's not super rare. Marylene's Fallacy because it's just so good, and we've anointed Sovereignty on it. And then we have a Fishing Rod. All it needs is 28% increased cast speed. That is very easy to roll yourself. You can do it as a magic item, or you can do it with Harvest Reforged Caster, I believe. And then it's just 24 to 28% is the possible rolls. So just try and hit 28 that way. And then we've got this good stuff belt. Essentially, all of this gear is pretty mediocre. Flasks are something I am going to be experimenting with as we go. I don't think my mana is perfect at the moment, so as a result, I'm not sure where I want to go with flasks. This is the sort of thing that gets worked out later. However, a couple of things to note with the flasks. We probably want to have a Jade Flask, a Quicksilver Flask, and then the rest probably need to include 1 Life Flask and 1 Mana Flask. I don't really like using a Mana Flask, but I think we're going to need it early on. And then there is Oriath's End as the Aspirational Flask. This comes from Uber Cirrus. It's going to be one of the last of the big upgrades you're going to want to have on the character, but this is absolutely fantastic. It causes an additional explosion, and guess what? These additional explosions, they can critically strike, and not only can they critically strike, they always critically strike, because that's the way that we've set up the character. So once you pop 1 or 2 enemies with this, you're then going to get a nice chain reaction of popcorn that's going to set the world on fire while you sit back and roast marshmallows on it. Then we have cluster jewels. Now you'll see there's a couple of empty jewel slots here, and also there's this Shadow Surfcaster prismatic jewel that's used as a configuration thing inside Path of Building. So that's just there because it's the way that it's currently implemented in Path of Building, these alternate ascendancies. These empties are things that you do want to find just general good stuff jewels for, but what exactly your character needs is going to depend upon how your gear differs from what I'm presenting here. So for instance, if you've got a little bit less fire resistance than I've got, then you'll need to get some fire resistance somewhere, and you could potentially get that on a jewel. There's a whole bunch of stats that you could use. I feel like anything that grants crit multiplier to lightning skills will be quite good, as will anything that grants damage to lightning skills. Or for that matter, unconditional lightning damage, unconditional cold damage. All of these will be quite good. Now we are using two very expensive jewels here, the Light of Meaning and Unnatural Instinct. These are a combo together, and I'll showcase where they go on the tree in a sec. But essentially, they work together in order to give you a whole bunch of percentage increased cold damage. A lot of damage comes from this, but it's not like the build is non-functional without this combo. So if we turn this off, you'll see that we drop about 30% of our damage is lost by losing that combo. So it is definitely worth having, but it's not something that's absolutely critical for everything to function. So consider that a luxury upgrade, but a pretty important luxury upgrade, whereas the Crest of Desire feels like it's kind of needed for the build to function. So our Unnatural Instinct goes here near Scion Start, and our Light of Meaning goes here. This will allow us, I think, to get the best benefit that we can out of those two powerful jewels. All right, so what's our passive tree texture look like? I'm going to start out in the shadow, come out through to Trickery, and then Blood Siphon, Coordination, pick up a Charisma cluster, pick up the Revenge of the Hunted cluster, and at some point, not early on, we want to pick up Inveterate and also the Spell Suppression Mastery. Spell Suppression Mastery can be a bit flexible. If you are under 100% chance to suppress, you probably want to change this to Lucky, but there's basically a lot of different options you have there. After that, at some point you want to push down into this Magebane area and pick up all of the good stuff here. Lots more suppression, Magebane itself, then there's just a bunch of good stuff en route to where the Light of Meaning goes, and also to where Harrier is there. You could also optionally pick up Hired Killer until you get Unnatural Instinct. Unnatural Instinct is actually going to brick this cluster, but until you've got that, it's worthwhile considering. Then the other things you want to pick up, probably the most important thing that's not obvious, we need to take the Nimbleness Cluster here. This doesn't look very good at first. The reason we're taking this is giving us, this whole cluster gives us 14% cast speed and 15% crit multi, which is okay, but it's nothing special. There's a bunch of crit chance that's actually a dead stat for us. But this caster mastery is ridiculously good. Spells which can gain intensity have +1 to maximum intensity. Keep that in mind. It'll be important when we come back to Crackling Lance in a sec. This editing GOG here, I don't think I reiterated quite enough just how important this caster mastery is. There are things on this passive tree you can skip. There are lots of nodes here that are a luxury to have, but that are just not really essential. For instance, you could drop the Revenge of the Hunted cluster, the build will still be fine, it'll just be a bit worse. You could drop a bunch of other things like some year suppression. Whatever the case, you do not skip this cluster because this caster mastery is almost as much damage as an entire Ascendancy notable when you're forced into a single target situation, and you will occasionally get forced into a single target situation. So, no ifs, no buts, no maybes. You take this, you don't skip it. If anyone skips this and then comes asking for help, I will mock you. After that, there's some crit multi here. There's Snowforged here, which gives us a 5% penalty on enemy resistances, which is quite important. There's Written in Blood, which is just good stuff. Likewise, Influence is good stuff. And we have Ghost Dance. Ghost Dance is something that gives us a little bit of defense because this build is quite squishy. Now, Soul Thief might seem a bit out of place. It's because this mastery is really good. This mastery is going to give us a whole chunk of extra evasion rating. We're not specialized in it. We are still going to be having like something like 70% of enemy hits are missing us. And that ends up giving us a fair bit of defense, especially alongside us freezing everything. Come back to the cluster jewel in a sec. Over here, we just pick up more good stuff. Breath of Rime, Heart of Ice, Breath of Lightning, Heart of Thunder. All of that's good. There's a couple of nodes in here that have a little bit of their power wasted, like percentage chance to freeze. Given that we're always critically striking, we don't really gain anything from that part of that text. But ultimately the cluster is still fine. And Cruel Preparation is another just genuine good stuff node, not anything amazing. Now, cluster jewel. Here, I have identified a few things you want to look for on your cluster jewels. Basically, the more of these you can get, the better. I've decided to go with something that is more reasonable. Storm Rider, Sadist, Doriani's Lesson, Snowstorm. All of these are fantastic notables. You would love to have a bunch of these if you can. They are easier to roll on a lightning cluster jewel, but the jewels are going to be better for you if you can get a cold one. So your ideal thing would be to have a cold cluster jewel that has 3 of those, but if you can't get that, then just settle for whatever you can get. And I think here, Doriani's Lesson, Snowstorm, and just 2 other mods, this is a perfectly reasonable thing that you could get. After that, there's a couple of jewel sockets up here that you can pick up. Doriani's Lesson, though, is particularly important. Elemental damage leached as life is really important on this build to provide you with a bit of a buffer against the self-inflicted damage that you're taking from your Storm Secret Ring. And Snowstorm is really good. Ultimately, I think it's probably Sadist that is the best of them. And it's important to note that if you do have Sadist on your cluster jewel, that provides you with a bonus that rewards you for inflicting ignites on enemies. Now, ignites cause a couple of complications here. You need to be dealing fire damage in order to inflict ignites, and if you automatically critically strike, even a very small amount of fire damage is enough. The problem is that all sources that add flat fire damage to spells do not apply to Heralds. Herald of Ice and Herald of Thunder, they don't get these benefits. There are a couple of convoluted ways, like you could link cold to fire support in, and then that would definitely work on your 2 Heralds, but I don't think that's the way to go. Instead, what I think you want to do here is have a single Abyss Jewel that has some amount of fire damage added to spells on it, and then you want to be using that in conjunction with Always Critting and in conjunction with Crackling Lance. You are not going to benefit from this unless you've used Crackling Lance recently, but most of the time when you need heavy damage, you will have fired off a Crackling Lance recently, and so that will cover the requirements there. So that's the tree setup that we're using. The skill setup that we mentioned, it's Crackling Lance inside our Crest of Desire, Herald of Ice, Herald of Thunder. Then we have Purity of Elements and Grace as defensive auras. Probably need Enlighten to use these all, and I feel like earlier on I'm just going to make do without Grace for a period. Frostbite is one utility skill, and then there's space for a lot of utility on the character. Now, my initial plan here, this is all subject to change, my initial plan is that I want Frostblink of Wintry Blast in conjunction with something that amps up the ailments it inflicts. That's going to be one of the things that I'll be using, but otherwise I'm just going to be experimenting with things here. So one of the major reasons that I don't like being super prescriptive about all of your utility is that it can vary quite a bit depending upon the items you happen to get. For example, one of the Cluster Jewel exclusive notables you can get inflicts exposure on enemies. If you get that, you don't want Wave of Conviction. If you don't get that, you probably do want Wave of Conviction. If you do end up running Wave of Conviction, I'm going to advocate that you link it to physical to lightning support, and then that's probably all you need in the way of links. That is then going to deal 75% lightning, 25% fire before the Ascendancy, and that's going to then be converted to 75% cold, 25% fire. Hey, how convenient. That's dealing fire damage and always crits, so if you've got Sadist, then that's always going to ignite. On top of that, it's also going to do a big chunk of cold damage and apply cold exposure, which is good because we're overwhelmingly dealing cold damage. The one thing though in utility that I think is essential, you must have Frostbite. I think you probably want to manually cast the Frostbite Curse, although if you prefer to do it via some other means, then go ahead. I don't see any real option to do it via Blasphemy. I don't think we've got any way of getting that amount of reservation, unless I guess you're willing to sacrifice Grace. But even then, Frostbite is less effective with Blasphemy. Ultimately, the decision's up to you, but my advocation here is that you go manually cast Wave of Conviction linked to physical to lightning, and manually cast Frostbite. Now, in terms of other miscellaneous things, there is always a question of which bandit do you want to kill. My first thought is that I want to help Creighton on this build because this character is a clear speed specialist, and 8% increased movement speed is really good. That said, I won't fault different decisions there. If you do something else, you can always change around later. And then there's a whole bunch of other utility that you can set up. You can upgrade to better boots than I've got here. I'm going to put a whole lot of notes in the description of this video below as to some of the ideas that I've had as to where things might be upgraded. But just keep in mind that a lot of these just are going to need to be tested out in practice. A lot of this sort of stuff just can't be worked out until you've played a character. Let's talk Crackling Lance now. Crackling Lance, you'll notice if you have a look in the path of building at the configurations, we have 4 intensities set up. What happens if we turn this off? Watch that combined DPS number that's currently 4.75 million, and you'll see it goes down, 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 down. This is because of Crackling Lance's tremendous synergy with standing still and just squeezing out a few spells, which is something that you couldn't normally do, except that on this character, you're going to be inflicting freeze, and that's going to give you the time in order to do so. Additionally, you don't need to stand still as long because you've got this additional boost to cast speed from Screaming Reels. Intensity, just watch the amount that it goes up as we go from 0 intensity to 1, we just jumped up by more than 60%. Another one, oh, it's just jumped up by another 900,000 damage, another 900,000, another 900,000. The reason for this is partly that we have a setting on the passive tree, this caster mastery, that grants +1 maximum intensity. I said that this is worth taking, this cluster, and it absolutely is. In fact, it's one of the best damage clusters on the tree. If you don't feel like you can spare points for this, then just drop some crit multi instead. The Throat Seeker cluster, that's nothing compared to the benefit you get from this. Crackling Lance, the way that this skill works, when you stand still and cast it, the first cast is at 0 intensity. Then the second cast is at 1, then 2, then 3, and then 4, because it's 3 naturally from the gem, but you can go up to 4 because of that mastery. This has the text 65% more damage with hits and elements per intensity. That's where all of that extra damage comes from. Additionally, 33% less branching angle per intensity. What this means is that when you get to maximum intensity, instead of hitting a huge amount of the screen, it instead hits a very, very focused line instead. So you can squeeze out one Crackling Lance if you just want to hit some trash monsters and kill them. But if you want to actually do some serious damage to a boss, then you're going to want to tighten things down a bit more. Anyways, this is where I'm thinking of starting. You will notice that this build is squishy. We're looking at 3,000 life with the gear that I've got established here. We're looking at only 20,000 evasion rating. We do have cap resistances and suppression, but it's not anything particularly amazing at all. And by default, we're not even capped on chaos resistance or even close. The main defensive layer that we have here is the propagating chains of freezes that we're going to be inflicting on enemies. We are going to be hitting them with Herald of Thunder. That is just going to be constantly firing around us, zapping enemies that are trying to sneak up on us, and inflicting a freeze on them, which is then going to stop them from acting and stop them from killing you. Likewise, you're going to be firing a Crackling Lance into a pack. That is then going to freeze a bunch of the weakest enemies there. They're then going to explode. So there's a lot of things that we've got that provide indirect defense, but this is definitely not going to be something that is going to be standing still and tanking tier 17 bosses. Freeze is your primary defensive layer. Your secondary defensive layer could actually be that some of those spare gem slots that you've got in your gear might just want to be a cast on death portal. All in all, I think this looks like it's something that will be a bit of fun. It's going to be something that needs to change as it's being worked on. This is not something that I would say, hey, this is an absolutely finished forever product. And additionally, it's going to be something that could benefit a lot from different flasks, but your flask should be addressed to your weaknesses and your strengths, rather than you just going, all right, these are the exact ones that I need for this build as it is. I want to quickly add in a section on leveling this build. This is not going to be a character that can function in its endgame style straight away. What I'm intending to do for leveling this build, I don't think this is the most optimized approach. This is what I'm planning to do though. I'm planning to level it as a character that is using Crackling Lance from early on. I'm going to be able to pick up Crackling Lance from level 28 and use Arc from 12 to 27. And I'm going to use Stormblast Mine from 1 until 11. I'm going to be using Orb of Storms most of that time as well. In terms of the Surfcaster Ascendancy, I'm firstly going to take the Ghosting node because the Ghosting node is ridiculously good. After that, I'm going to take the Cold Conversion node. From that point on, I think I'll be inflicting a moderate amount of chills at least, if not freezes, and that's going to provide some indirect defense. But ultimately, we're still going to be going with Orb of Storms and Crackling Lance most of the way. Once we get solidly into endgame, we'll start putting in things like Heralds, we'll start putting in things like Auras in order to make ourselves a little bit more defensive. But ultimately, I don't think that this is going to be a powerful way to level a character. It's just simply going to be a functional way to level a character. If you want to optimize this a bit more, what I would suggest you do is level as Power Siphon Mines instead. Power Siphon Mines is something, there's a whole bunch of people that have done a whole lot of different ways of setting that character up in the 3.25 Settlers expansion over in the normal game. What you want to do then is your first nodes in the Surfcaster Ascendancy is going to be the Ghosting. Your second node is then going to be Sea Legs, which is a defensive node, the one that gives you 30% to cold and lightning resistances. And then after that, you don't take the fishing rod stuff until you've got a fishing rod. That can be quite late in the game, that's fine. That's going to be the way that I would advocate leveling this setup. And realistically, you swap over into the final form or something approaching the final form once you've got Crest of Desire, and it's a +8 Crest of Desire. And also, once you've got Pragmatism, which should be pretty easy. Marylene's Fallacy, that'll be easy in comparison to Crest of Desire. Once you've got Crest of Desire, that's when you start swapping over. And then that's when you start looking for your fishing rod as well. If you don't already have one, then that's when you're going to start looking for it. If you do already have one, well, that's fantastic. Remember, Fairgraves' Tricon has that secret mod on it, so just pick up a Fairgraves' Tricon when you can, go and farm your own fishing rod, maybe leave it on for the whole Atlas setup as well, so that you then maybe get some more of them. They might end up being good trade bait this league, and we shall find that out. If you've got any questions, fire away down below. Otherwise, I'm going to leave it there. May your Val orbs have interesting results. And remember, Valing fishing orbs can have good results.